Hello, my Old Testament introduction students. This is a short video in which I'm going to say a few things about 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and then a quick heads up regarding what is going to come up on the midterm. I'll have a study guide out to you probably by sometime tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow evening. But I'll say a few things about it here as well. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on 1st Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So let's just hit the highlights. You're supposed to do the homework, some background stuff. I'm just going to tell you what's really important. When it gets right down to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, basically, everything we've been doing from Deuteronomy all the way to 2nd Kings, that's Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, all of that is the work of the Deuteronomistic writer, and that is set to be probably written in its final form during the exile. And you have to realize that's the setting because all of those books kind of go toward that fundamental question of the Jews in the exile. How did we end up in exile? We thought we were God's people. And so you realize that, and then you read all that stuff. By talking about their history, it emphasizes their covenant failure, even some of their best kings like Solomon were still kind of questionable. And so all those books answer that question. Why are we here in exile? Because we broke the covenant. That's why it's so negative most of the time in all those books. Now contrast that with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was probably written around 400 BC, BCE, around that general time period, after they had come back from the exile. They had come back in 539, I believe. They had settled, a couple generations have passed, and things weren't going so well. If you know the history of that time, they were having a tough time of it. As God's people coming out of exile, why are we having such a hard time? Given that situation, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is speaking to people who are struggling, and therefore it's not the time to beat them over the head on how much of a failure they are, like in the exile. Therefore, in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it focuses, it's kind of a pep talk. It's kind of like if you're on a basketball team and it's halftime, and you're getting your butts kicked, and you're in the locker room at halftime, losing 64-12. You feel horrible. You feel like a loser. That's not the time the coach is going to come in and just beat you over the head even more. He needs to encourage you. And so when it gets right down to it, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is meant to be an encouragement to the returned exiles who had been back in the land for over 100 years, who were struggling, and it's trying to encourage them to keep the faith, to stay faithful to the God of Israel, to stay faithful to the temple, and to the covenant, to the Torah. And that's why, and this is the big difference between 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, even though they cover much of the same time, 1st and 2nd Chronicles basically ignores the northern kingdom. They're lost. We're not even going to worry about them. They just focus on the kingdom of Judah, starting with David, Solomon, and then the righteous kings of Judah. Okay? So that's the first difference. It just focuses on Judah, doesn't even care about the north. The second thing is it just focuses mostly on the good things. So if you read 2 Samuel about the reign of David, there's a lot of questionable things. David and Bathsheba, a whole bunch of other family problems. Solomon had his problems. Those negative things are mentioned in 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Samuel. First and Second Chronicles doesn't focus on the negative stuff. It just focuses on the positive. David was a man after God's own heart. He was God's chosen. He wanted to build the temple, but Solomon built the temple, and the temple was awesome. So it's focusing on the positive. And it really focuses on the importance of worship in the temple and doing that, because that's at the centerpiece of God's relationship with Israel. So, when you realize that, that's why, even though First and Second Chronicles covers the same time period as Samuel and Kings, it has a much different flavor because it's speaking to a different time. All right? Now, and it's even, I'll even throw this out. One of the worst kings in Judah's history was King Manasseh. He was the son of Hezekiah. If you read in 2 Kings, he's like the worst. He introduced pagan worship. He's just irredeemably bad. In 2 Chronicles, when it covers Manasseh in chapter 33, it acknowledges he was bad. But even then, it kind of points out, like halfway through his reign, he kind of repented and he ended up being pretty good. So that's the kind of vibe that you get for the First and Second Chronicles. Those are the main things you have to know about it. That's all I'm going to be asking about, some general things on that for the midterm. As far as Ezra Nehemiah is concerned, we should probably see it as one book. The textbook teases this out, but it's structured in a very particular way. Ezra 1 through 6 tells about the initial return from exile under under Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. So Ezra 1 through 6 talks about that initial return from exile. And I'll say a few more things about that in a minute. After that, Ezra 7 through 10, that's where you actually learn about Ezra the scribe, who returned about a generation later. He grew up in exile in Babylon, Persia by now. In chapter 7 through 10, he comes back to Jerusalem, and he is a scribe and he's a priest, and his job is to initiate religious and social reforms among the returned exile community. Okay? Then, part 3, if you will, Nehemiah 1 through 7 talks about Nehemiah's arrival, about a decade after Ezra. And his big thing is when he gets to Jerusalem, he sees that even though they have been living back in Judea for almost a century now, not quite a century, the walls of Jerusalem were still torn down and they were defenseless. And so Nehemiah, as the new governor, his big thing he's known for is he rebuilds the walls in Jerusalem despite opposition of the other people who are living in the land. And he also enacts a number of social reforms, which we'll get to in a second. And then part 4, if you will, there's more memoirs about Ezra and Nehemiah reading the Torah, getting the people to renew the covenant, etc., etc. And then Nehemiah 1 through 11 is the dedication of the wall in Jerusalem and further social and religious reforms. So basically, Ezra and Nehemiah are all about those things. Now, let me go through the specific history of what happened after the exile. And you'll need to look at that handwritten timeline I had made available in one of the files a while ago. Because when we do get to the exam, you're going to want to know some basic dates. But for now, let's just focus on the return from exile. I like dates for the test. They're objective. I want you to know, you don't have to know every single detail, every single date, but I want you to know the main things, because one of the big things, if you want to understand the Old Testament, you have to nail down the general historical timeline. So right now, on the midterm, that's going to be a big thing, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But for now, let's just focus on the return from exile stuff. They came back from the exile in 539. That is when King Cyrus of Persia made the decree that exiled peoples could return to their homeland. So 539, they returned from exile. Then what happens, and they return from exile under some kind of Davidic descendant, Sheshbazzar, a prince of Judah, and then Zerubbabel was the governor, and Joshua was the high priest. Okay? So they come back in 539, and they start rebuilding the temple a little bit, but they don't do much of it at first. When Cyrus dies in roughly 530, the new king of Persia, he halts, he orders that they not be allowed to continue rebuilding the temple. Okay, the reason for that, because this is the situation when they came back. When the Jewish exiles came back to Judea, they found other people living there, basically foreigners. And this is what had happened over a couple generations, is that there were some Jews who had remained in the land, the poorest of the poor. They remained in the land. On top of that, you still had from the northern kingdom that had been destroyed a century before, those remnants had intermarried with foreigners, and then those foreigners intermarried with the remnants of the people of Judah who were there, and the people who were then living in the land were kind of this mixed ethnicity kind of people. Long story short, Samaritans. Okay, when you get to the New Testament, the reason why Jews and Samaritans hated each other is because Jews were descendants of the kingdom of Judah. Their descendants had gone into exile. The Samaritans were kind of like the descendants of foreigners intermarrying with Israelites, intermarrying with some unscrupulous Jews. They were kind of half-breed ickies. Okay, that's where the real conflict between Jews and Samaritans happened after the exile. This is the situation. So anyway, because of that conflict, some of the people of the land complained to the new king that these Jews were trying to rebuild things and you shouldn't trust them. And so he orders it to a halt. Now, where's my notes? We'll worry about that. So that happens in roughly 530. Then, in 520-ish, that king dies, and there's a question of who he is. Xerxes, Artaxerxes, we're not going to focus on that. But in 520, a new king, Darius, comes to power. And this is really interesting what happens in Judea. It's at this time in 520 that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah start prophesying about how the Jews need to rebuild the temple. Okay? So when we get to Haggai and Zechariah and the prophets, you'll read about it. But here, they say, God wants you to rebuild the temple. So even though they didn't have permission, but there was a new emperor, a new king, the Jews just started rebuilding the temple without permission. And some of the people of the land sent a letter back to Darius saying, hey, did they have permission to do this? And Darius looks back in the records, and here's the interesting thing. He finds the edict of Cyrus from 539 that says they can go home and rebuild the temple, but he misses the order to stop. So he basically says, yeah, they have permission to do it. It kind of reminds me of when I was a kid and I wanted like a ho-ho or a ding-dong, but it was getting close to dinner time, and I know my mom would say no. I would wait until she went to the bathroom, then I'd go to the pantry and I'd get like a ho-ho or a ding-dong, and I'd take a bite. I'd do it without her permission, but then I would knock on her door while she's still in the bathroom, and I would say, hey, Mom, can I have a ho-ho? And then she would say, well, you know, it's getting close to dinner. And I was like, well, I've already taken a bite. And then she'd like, well, okay, I guess it's okay. That's kind of what the Jews did to get the temple to rebuild. They started doing it anyway and then got permission later. So in 520, they start rebuilding the temple with Haggai and Zechariah prophesying they should. And they do it in 4 years. So 539 is big deal. 530 is when they have ordered to stop. 520 is when they start rebuilding, and 516 is when the temple is rebuilt. The new temple is rebuilt in 516. Okay? That is all I talked about in Ezra 1 through 6. That's the timeline. Now, when Ezra shows up in 7 through 10, that happens a generation later, and it's on your timeline, which I don't have in front of me, and I haven't memorized my timeline perfectly, but I will. Ezra shows up in 458. So a good, 60 years or so has passed between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. Okay, so Ezra 1 through 6 is the backstory of the initial exiles. A generation later, Ezra comes back in 458. He starts doing his reforms to get the returned exiles to focus on the Torah. And then Nehemiah comes in 445, and he rebuilds the walls, and he does further social reforms. So that's what you need to know about Ezra and Nehemiah. All right? If you want to really nail it down, when it comes to Ezra and Nehemiah, the importance of keeping the covenant. You have to remember, now that they're back from exile. Remember, they went into exile because they broke the Mosaic covenant and it was broken. So now they are resurrected as a people, so to speak, as a nation, and they come back to the land, and their question is, okay, what is the return from exile, resurrected people of God going to look like, so to speak? Ezra and Nehemiah's answer is, we need to center it on the temple and the Torah. That's what we've always done. That's what the people of God do. So that's one of the main themes in Ezra and Nehemiah, the emphasis of keeping of the covenant. And also Nehemiah is famous for rebuilding the walls. That's also important. And then obviously reorganizing the community around temple and Torah. That's what the Ezra and Nehemiah is about. Okay. Finally, the book of Esther is as a grand tale, and as you will know when you read your textbook for the assignment, there is a question of whether or not it is historical. There isn't a lot of extra biblical evidence for it, but at the same time, it's clearly a story about the plight of the Jews living in Persia. Esther, during that time period, is roughly, let's put it this way, while Ezra and Nehemiah were doing their thing in Judea in 458, 445-ish, right around that time, Esther is in Persia dealing with the story of Esther. So they're kind of contemporary on the historical timeline-wise. But there is a question of whether or not Esther is historical. You just don't know. I don't go so far to say it wasn't historical, because obviously it is commemorating the feast of Purim. So something must have happened for them to have that feast to begin with. But anyway, the big thing about Esther, there's two or three things. The interesting thing about Esther is that at no time in the book of Esther is the name of God used. God isn't even mentioned. But obviously he's in the background. He's clearly orchestrating things. But Esther is the one book that doesn't actually invoke the name of the God of Israel. It's all about the preservation of the people of the Jews in exile, even though they're not technically in exile anymore, because exile is over, but they're still living there. And the story itself is just a fun story to read. There's, the villain Haman, Mordecai, the uncle, who's kind of this smart but guy who none of the Persians like. Esther is the heroine. And basically, through her smarts and her courage, she is able to save her people from the disaster that Haman had planned. And the story itself is just a wonderful story. There's not much to say about it other than those couple things. It commemorates the Feast of Purim. It's about the Jews living in foreign lands, banding together to save them, their group identity, against some really bad pagan actors. All right. So there you go, five Old Testament books in a few, like 20 minutes. Now, when it comes to the midterm, again, I'll be sending you a, study guide in the next day or two, where I'll detail, the kinds of things I want you to know. I like charts. So, I'm going to ask you about how Genesis 1 is laid out. I'm going to ask you about how Genesis 1 through 11 is laid out, the flow chart. When it comes to the patriarchs, obviously you have to know the 3 parts of the covenant and those major things. Some of the stories in Abraham I want you to know, but I'll articulate which ones. Because obviously there's so much we covered. I'm going to have to give you some heads up on the general areas that you want to know. Obviously, the Exodus to Deuteronomy. There's going to be a number of things you want to know is there, which I'll put in the study guide. The big thing, and I'll probably have a number of matching things. I'll break it up into maybe 2 or 3 different matching sections. But the timeline, you're going to want to know some of the basic dates. Now here, obviously Genesis 1 through 11 doesn't have clear dates, so that's off the table. We kind of noted that the patriarchs were sometime in the 2000-ish to 1800-ish. That's kind of foggy. I probably won't ask about that. The big thing about the Exodus, is it the mid-15th century or the mid-13th century, which is, did the Exodus happen roughly 1440 or 1240? At least know those are the 2 options. Joshua, you want to know that there are 3 basic campaigns to the book of Joshua: the central, northern, southern, or central, southern, northern. Judges. I always like to ask this, just for the judges' sake. The major judges know who the enemies are, so look over that. So Ehud fought Eglon the Moabite. Deborah was King Jabin the Canaanite and General Sisera. Gideon, Midian, easy to remember. Jephthah was the Ammonites, and then Samson was the Philistines. At least know what judge fought what people group. Then the real dates that you want to start knowing really start with First and Second Kings. Obviously, Saul, David, and Solomon are the first 3 kings of the United Kingdom. Now, as far as the dates, I'm going to throw a few right now. Make sure you know these for your on the timeline. I'm going to say 742 is the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. Now, when I say 742, we don't know exactly that's the exact date, but that's the general time period. You want to know what happened during the Syro-Ephraimite crisis in roughly 742. You want to know 721, the fall of the northern kingdom, the fall of Samaria. That's the capital of the northern kingdom. That's a big date to know. You want to know 701, Sennacherib's invasion, what happened there. That is when Hezekiah rebelled against Assyria, and Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came in, leveled a whole bunch of Judean towns, but didn't take Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was spared. Okay, that's 701. So 742, 721, 701. Then you want to know some of the dates about Josiah. He came to the throne in 640. He's the last great king of the kingdom of Judah. He starts his reforms in 628. He finds the book of the law in 621. So things are looking good. The kingdom of Judah turns to the Torah and the covenant. And then 612, their tormentor, Assyria, Nineveh falls. Yay. But then tragedy happens in 609 when Josiah is killed in battle by Pharaoh Necho. And from 609 to the exile is just one steep decline. 605 is the Battle of Carchemish. That is the death blow to Assyria. And Assyria is dead as an empire in 605. And Babylon is the new big dog on the block in 605. 8 years later in 597, that's when Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem first. That's the first deportation. He takes the royalty and a lot of the elites of Jerusalem to Babylon with him. This would be, the first deportation would have been the time Daniel is taken and Ezekiel is taken. That's when they're taken. Then 10 years later, 587 is the end of the kingdom of Judah, the fall of Jerusalem, when Nebuchadnezzar comes back and levels the city and levels the temple. And then after that, the exile happens between 587 and 539, and I just went over the post-exilic dates that you have to know. So you're going to want to know the dates. That's going to be a section of the midterm. But I will give you, like I said, I'll give you a study guide probably by tomorrow, so you know what to focus on. I'm going to try to make it mostly matching and multiple choice, objective things, a few short answers, so you can explain a few things. But be looking for the study guide tomorrow, and we'll see how things go. All right, bye.